The title of this presentation is They're Killing Us Off. Let's begin this with a quote. First of all, they came to take the gypsies, and I was happy because they pilfered. Then they came to take the Jews, and I said nothing because they were unpleasant to me. Then they came to take the homosexuals, and I was relieved because they were annoying me. Then they came to take the communists, and I said nothing because I was not a communist. One day they came to take me, and there was nobody left to protest. In this spirit, during this presentation, we will cover poverty and economic harm, the deteriorating condition of the middle class, financial inequality, the uncertain economy, the impact on the middle class, environmental and climate change, the impact of these forces on health, the use of drugs and addiction, the effect of heat and cold, the plight of many senior Americans, effects on America as a land of opportunity. The problem is some people don't care. And to restore the middle class and what you can do. The war on poverty in the U.S. isn't over. In 2018, the federal poverty line for a family of four in the contiguous U.S. was $25,100. It's somewhat higher in Hawaii and Alaska. 12.7% of the U.S. population was in poverty in 2016, and the rate has hovered between 12 to 15% since 1980. 27% of female-headed households with no other adult live in poverty, dramatically higher than the 5% poverty rate of married couples. Poverty exists in all areas of the country, but the population living in high poverty neighborhoods has increased over time. Following the Great Recession of 2008, some 14 million people lived in extremely poor neighborhoods, more than twice as many as had done so in 2000. An increasing number of struggling Americans are turning to check cashiers and payday loans. A record 95.5 million Americans are not in the labor force, and that number does not include children. 1/3 of working Americans support the other 2/3. Those not in the labor force are increasing at a much faster rate than the general growth in the population. The chart here shows that there are 112 million people in the private labor force, 35% of the adult population, where 65% is not. 95% of those people are people who are not even looking for work, and 70 million cannot work because of disability. Even as employers struggle to hire new workers, wages remain stagnant. Average hourly pay has held flat for the past year after adjusting for inflation. Real wages for middle wage workers are flat, growing at about the same rate as inflation, meaning the only way working families can grow their incomes is working more hours. Consumer prices keep going up. The red line, the bottom line, is for food and energy. While the capabilities of electronic goods like our smartphones, computers, and TVs get better, while the costs remain relatively stable, we need to be more concerned that the cost of basic necessities like food, fuel, healthcare, childcare, senior care, education, and housing have skyrocketed. About 70% of millennials regret buying their homes. 1 in 3 millennials dipped into their retirement accounts to pay for their homes. Buying on home costs more than the mortgage, taxes, and utilities. Homeowners spent an additional $6,649 on average in the past 12 months on home improvement projects and home maintenance. Millennials spent less than other generations due to their more limited financial ability and spent less than $5,700 a year. Millennials, in an attempt to spend more time in the real world rather than the virtual one, have begun swapping out iPhones for old-fashioned flip phones. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics show the number of people working in contingent jobs decreased from 2005 to 2017, although the Bureau's methodology could be undercounting the gig worker population. Business owners and certain self-employed workers aren't counted as contingent or alternative workers, so gig workers who might think of themselves as business owners, as many Etsy sellers do, for example, will be missed by this definition. Millennials make up perhaps the largest number of people missed. The Small Business Administration reported in 2014 that less than 2% of millennials were self-employed, compared to 7.6% of Generation X and 8.3% of baby boomers. No doubt many millennials are undercounted because they are gig workers. Some millennials take their work on the go or postpone getting a real job in order to see the world, identifying as a millennial nomad is now a desirable aim. This is a time of an uncertain economy. Manufacturers are expressing concern about tariffs, higher prices, and supply disruptions that they attribute to the new trade policies such as the trade war with China. Many companies are skeptical about their ability to profitably conduct business. The official low unemployment rate hides more troubling realities. Legions of college grads overqualified for their jobs, a growing number of contract workers with no job security, and an army of part-time workers desperate for full-time jobs. Almost 80% of Americans say they live from paycheck to paycheck, many not knowing how big their next paycheck will be. The junk debt that tanked the economy in 2013, it may be back. 70% of the loans were made by major banks whose lending are closely scrutinized by government bank regulators. That figure is now down to 54% according to Bloomberg, as hedge funds, private equity firms, insurance companies, and non-regulated lenders have entered the market in a big way. This shift in market share away from banks mirrors what happened to mortgage lending in the run-up to the 2008 crash, when competition from unregulated lenders led banks to lowering lending standards in an effort to maintain their market share, and that led to the Great Recession of 2008. This chart shows how financial inequalities ramp up. In the United States, 79% of the wealth in this country is held by 10% of the households. That goes down in all the other major developed countries to a low of 41% in Japan, where 41% have a disproportionate share. This slide is entitled Passing of the Middle Class. Middle class existence is now 30% more expensive than it was 20 years ago. During these years, the price of health care and the cost of a 4-year degree at a public college have nearly doubled. Earning $100,000 sounds marvelous until you've forked over half to housing and 30% to childcare. The U.S. is the richest and also the most unequal country in the world, featuring the largest wealth inequality gap of the 200 wealthiest countries in the world. In Silicon Valley, home prices are unaffordable even for tech workers. A survey found that 59% of tech workers, including many at 13 major tech companies, say they cannot afford to buy a home. The number of people who live in their vehicles because they can't find affordable housing is on the rise, even though it's illegal in many U.S. cities. The number of people residing in campers and other vehicles surged 46% over the past year. A recent homeless census in Seattle's King County, Washington, found the problem is exploding in cities with expensive housing markets, including Los Angeles, Portland, and San Francisco. 1 in 5 Americans say they have more credit card debt than they do in emergency savings, and less than 40% of Americans say they have enough savings to cover a $1,000 emergency room visit or car repair. When health insurance prices rose last year, around 1 million Americans dropped their insurance coverage. The Trump administration suspended a program that pays billions of dollars to insurers to stabilize health insurance markets under the Affordable Care Act, a freeze that will drive up premiums indefinitely. Many Americans suffer from lack of funds. 78% of ill Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Each day is one bit of bad luck away from disaster. When 43% of Americans can't pay for food and rent, we can safely say the economy leaves many behind. Financial stress and illness are lockstep and feed on one another. Trade wars affect the poor and the middle class. Basic necessities such as food and clothing make up a larger share of working class household expenditures when compared to higher income families, and most of those products are imported. Foreign producers make up an overwhelming percentage of sales of many basic goods, such as shoes. In fact, one manufacturing industry group reports that 80% of Walmart's suppliers are housed across the Pacific. One 2017 paper estimated that a 10% across-the-board increase in tariffs on imported goods would cost the poorest 20% of earners $300 a year. That's a meaningful chunk of the less than $13,000 earned by the poorest U.S. households in 2015. Moreover, Trump's first round of tariffs weren't the 10% used in the study, they are 25%. And the president isn't stopping there. While the White House initially threatened a 10% tariff increase on the next $200 billion of goods he's targeting, officials reportedly considering that raising that to 25%. Taken together, this means the real impact of tariffs on household incomes could be more than double earlier estimates. America's white-collar middle class takes a terrifying slide down the mobility ladder. With incomes flat or falling, Americans scramble to maintain a semblance of what their parents enjoyed. They are moving from being dominant to being dominated, from acting to acted upon. Trained to be educators, lawyers, librarians, and accountants. They do work they can't stand to support families they rarely see. There are Uber-driving teachers and law school grads reviewing documents for $20 an hour or less. Ivy Leaguers who live on food stamps. On-demand jobs are changing the way we work. One person doing many types of work that in the past were done by tradespeople or people specializing in one thing, doing odd jobs for sites like Fiverr.com, Upwork.com, Guru.com, Gigcoin, and TopTal. People who grew up as members of the middle class realize as adults you will not do as well as your parents. Life is a struggle to keep up. Even if you achieve something, you may live in fear of losing it. Some people have come to feel that America belongs to the ultra-rich. Lacking unions, church communities, and nearby close relatives to support them, the middle class find themselves isolated and stranded. Despite the much trumpeted low unemployment rate, the New York Times reports that jobs are often subpar, featuring little stability and security. Once upon a time, only the working poor took second jobs to stay afloat. Now the middle class has joined them in taking second jobs. Americans are the fattest people on earth. Pain relates to obesity. More than 70% of both men and women in the U.S. are overweight or obese. This in turn causes inflammation and the stress weight puts on joints and disturbs sleep that comes from sleep apnea. Americans consume nearly 80% of the global supply of painkillers. Paradoxically, opiates heighten the perception of pain rather than dulling it. If the U.S. middle class disappears, so will the U.S. economy as a way of getting ahead in life. We cease to be shocked at reports of 131-degree temperatures. The planetary heat wave we've experienced this year has begun to turn the tide of public opinion from denial and indifference to acceptance that climate change is a real threat to our safety. Environmental damage is exacerbating social inequality and contributing to increased political instability. Water underlies the rivalries and wars in the Middle East. In the U.S., people are realizing climate change is affecting their lives. 70% of Americans believe in climate change. Extreme weather patterns, drought, a loss of biodiversity, an onslaught of diseases, and the mental health consequences inflicted by a rapidly changing planet. Florida is experiencing record-breaking red tides. Red tides not only deplete the oxygen levels in the surrounding water, they lead to the production of a whole series of toxins that kill fish and other marine life. Hot weather makes these blooms even stronger, which is why these events are not uncommon in the summer months. But what's happening off Florida is exceptional. There are actually multiple blooms of toxic organisms happening at the same time. Heat and cold. In 2017, the third hottest year on record, we saw dozens of deaths as record-setting heat baked swaths of the country from the Pacific Northwest to the Southeast. It was part of a devastating, record-setting disaster year with extreme heat, torrential rain, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and cold. Scientists expect some of these events to become more severe and frequent as the climate changes, but they're still grappling with how to anticipate and prepare for conditions like cold snaps and heat waves to keep them from becoming deadlier. One surprisingly difficult question is figuring out what's more dangerous, the heat or the cold. The National Weather Service says that heat is 3 times deadlier than cold. The World Meteorological Organization reported that heat-related deaths and illnesses have risen steadily since 1980, and now 30% of the world's population lives in regions vulnerable to heat waves. A 2015 Lancet paper found that cold was 20 times deadlier than heat. Looking at more than 74 million deaths between 1984 and 2012, the researchers found cold deadlier and people respond to changes in temperature differently depending upon the city they live in. Scientists have a good understanding of the temperature limits of the human body, so it stands to reason that as the weather reaches these danger zones, more people will die. While it's difficult to link any individual death to a temperature extreme, since fatalities don't often come from the heat and the cold per se, but from worsening underlying conditions like asthma and high blood pressure. Studies show that fatalities increase as the temperature shifts away from 75 degrees Fahrenheit in either direction, and the effect is worse in women than men. Most studies show that heat is more dangerous than cold on balance. California scientists are reviewing 50 years of records, found a link between higher than usual temperatures and suicide rates in the United States and Mexico. Donald Trump's reaction to reports of climate change, quote, "This very expensive global warming bullshit has got to stop." 10,000 years ago, humans and livestock were a mere 0.1% of land mass air vertebrate biomass. Now humans and livestock are 97% of the Earth's land air vertebrate biomass. Every 4.5 days, 1 million humans are added to Earth, and we must produce more food in the next 50 years than we have in the past 10,000 years combined. Crop and pasture land cultivation caused 80% of all land vertebrate extinctions. And here are some of the species lost: rhinos, tigers, lions, sea turtles, monarch butterflies, big ocean fish, Antarctic krill, forest elephants, the Great Barrier Reef, half of it's gone. Human sperm counts, half are reduced. Western gorillas, forest bird species, giraffes, ocean polyplankton, marine birds, and land and marine animals since 1970. Americans are dying younger than people in other rich nations. We spend thousands of dollars more per capita on health care than any other country in the world, but in return we live shorter lives than most people in rich nations. Most Americans 55 and older have suffered through chronic pain that lasted 3 months or longer. Most say they found relief ranging from medication to yoga. Still, more than 1 in 5 had to abandon sports, exercise, or other daily activities. Nearly 2/3 of those with chronic pain said it had affected their lives, and many, 20% of 55 to 64-year-olds and 25% of 65 plus, said it compelled them to give up sports, exercise, painting, gardening, or other pastimes. Legal drugs can run a person over $300 for a 30-day supply. Orphan drugs, which include personalized medicines, now constitute 40% of all new drug approvals and will soon be a majority of prescriptions that are approved. They cost patients on average $83,000 per patient per year. American spending for prescription drugs is expected to pass $1.3 trillion in 2018. This number is larger than the gross domestic product of 15 countries combined. As the cost of prescription drugs continues to rise, so does the share of their costs patients pay. Deductibles, for example, have on average increased 2.5 times over the past decade. And prescription drugs account for 1 of every $10 spent on healthcare in the U.S. and is climbing. Now, why do people become addicted? When people feel disconnected from society, lonely, insecure, they turn to drugs, alcohol, or food to relieve mental anguish. For example, since 1960, obesity has risen in American men from 10% to 40% and in women from 15 to 40%. Therapists in the U.S. say they have seen a rise in politically related anxiety in the months following the election of U.S. President Donald Trump, calling the phenomenon Trump anxiety disorder. In the United States, the rise in deaths from despair, committing suicide, abuse of drugs, and alcohol has shot up since the late 1990s among middle-aged white Americans. Since 1999, deaths from opiates have quadrupled. Opiates kill more than 50,000 Americans a year, 10,000 more than AIDS did at its peak, more too than gun homicides and motor vehicle accidents. Every day, 100 Americans die of overdosing. More than 42,000 Americans died of opiate overdoses alone in 2016, a 28% increase over 2015. American life expectancy at birth declined for the second consecutive year in 2016, fueled by the staggering rise in the death rate from drug overdoses, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Accidental deaths in the United States rose significantly in 2016, becoming the third leading cause of fatalities for the first time in more than a century, a trend fueled by the steep rise in opiate overdoses. Accidents, defined by the National Safety Council as unintentional preventable injuries, claimed a record 161,374 lives in 2016, a 10% increase over the prior year. They include motor vehicle crashes, falls, drowning, choking, and poisoning, a category that encompasses accidental overdoses. Opiate overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 50, and suicide now ranks in the top 10 leading causes of death in the U.S. Seniors in America are hurting. The GI Bill programs assisted many in the 1950s to achieve their personal, professional, and retirement goals. Today, more seniors are filling homeless shelters. They work hard their whole life and then they retire to poverty. Social Security benefits average $1,232 per month, according to the Social Security Administration. This is equivalent to $14,784 a year. The threshold of poverty in America for a household containing persons over the age of 65 is $14,326 per year. The Social Security Administration estimates that 21% of married couples and 43% of single seniors rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. So millions of seniors are living below or near the poverty line. $700 billion will disappear from Social Security's coffers in the next decade, raising uncertainty for the millennials. SNAP, or Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, is an essential safety net program for millions of older adults who would otherwise be at risk for hunger and hunger-related health problems. In fact, 22% of households receiving SNAP, nearly 4.7 million, have at least one age adult 60 or older. The vast majority of senior SNAP recipients live alone. Over 80% of households with at least one adult age over 60 or older are single-person households. More than 8 million adults and 50 or older are affected by isolation, and the health risks of prolonged isolation are equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. These individuals may be particularly vulnerable if they are disabled or in poor health, which could make it difficult for them to buy or prepare food. The number of SNAP-eligible older adults ages 60 and older will likely increase in coming years as the U.S. population ages. Yet SNAP participation is remarkably low among seniors, with only 42% of those eligible actually enrolled. Possible reasons for this include the stigma around receipt of government benefits, confusion over the complex eligibility requirements, burdensome application processes, and simply not knowing the programs exist. Retirement is becoming more expensive, and the future generations may have to abandon the idea altogether. Ill health will mean that working past the age of 65 is more common. In fact, between 1977 and 2007, employment of workers 65 and older increased 101%, compared to a much smaller increase of 59% for total employment 16 and over. The number of employed men 65 and over rose 75%, but employment of women 65 and older increased by nearly twice as much, climbing 147%. While the number of employed people aged 75 and over is relatively small, 0.8% of those employed in 2007, this group had the most dramatic gain, increasing 172% between 1977 and 2007. This is despite nearly 2 out of 3 workers aged 45 and older have seen or experienced age discrimination on the job. 91% said they believe such discrimination is common. People aged 85 and over have doubled over the decade. The jobs they get include crossing guards, truckers, ranchers, and musicians. When there's not enough money for the month, what kinds of jobs can we get when we're old and gray? Will we be well enough to work, and will anyone want to employ us? At the same time, the trend for younger people is different. People who are 30 and younger are staying out of the labor force at rates not seen since the 1960s and 70s, when women weren't yet entering the workforce at the level they are today. As of 2015, there were around 450,000 living centenarians, and this number is set to increase eightfold over the next 3 decades. In the U.S., they're the fastest growing age group. With trends like this, it's no wonder Americans are experiencing economic woes. Billionaires are planning to leave the rest of us behind. In 2015, the top 1% of Americans made 26.3 times as much as the bottom 99%, an increase from 2013 when they earned 25.3% per times as much. The top 1% of Americans took home more than 22% of all income in 2015. That's the highest share since a peak of 23.9 just before the Great Depression in 1928. The richest 10% of Americans now own 84% of all stocks. The Koch family has 44 officials in the Trump administration. The Koches have already achieved the majority of goals contained in Roadmap to Repeal, a policy document published in January 2017 by Freedom Partners, a Koch group. The rich have exclusive access to parallel systems of transport, healthcare, education, etc. The rich avoid trains, subways, lenders, coach-class air transport, standard healthcare, and the rest of the decaying, dysfunctional systems they own that extract wealth from 90% of the population. They fly on private aircraft, have their own healthcare and legal services, use their privileges to get their offspring into elite universities and institutions, and have access to elite banking and lending services that are unavailable to most people. The infrastructure of the nation used by most Americans is poorly maintained and costly to operate. Dysfunctional institutions with unlimited power to extract money via junk fees, licensing fees, parking, tickets, penalties, late fees, all without recourse, and mess with the extractive parasitic bureaucracy, and you'll regret it. Cartels that limit competition and fix prices and quasi-monopolies are parasitically extracting the wealth of the nation for their owners and managers. Cartels include healthcare, banking, national defense, national security, corporate mainstream media, and student loans. Apple and Google provide the software for 99% of all smartphones. Amazon exerts utter dominance over online shopping and is getting bigger fast in areas like streaming of music and videos. Today, almost half of the assets in the American financial system are controlled by 5 banks. In the late 1990s, the top 5 banks controlled a little more than 1/5 of the market. Over the past decade, 6 of the largest airlines merged into 3. 4 companies now control 98% of the American wireless market, and that number could fall to 3 if T-Mobile and Sprint are allowed to merge. That's according to the New York Times. The corporate establishment has been winning this battle for decades by keeping us divided between those who place the blame on business and the market, and those who place the blame on government. And the problem is that some people don't care, in the same spirit as Marie Antoinette when she allegedly said, "Let them eat cake." Here's some quotes. "Americans with pre-existing conditions are crooks and grifters," Senator Rick Santorum. "Sorry, Jimmy Kimmel, your sad story doesn't obligate me or anybody else to pay for somebody else's health care," former Congressman Joe Walsh. Senator Orrin Hatch said Medicaid is giving money to the dole. And former Republican Jason Chaffetz said Americans have choices, and so maybe rather than getting that new iPhone they just love, maybe they should invest in their own health care. And President Trump said, "Just repeal Obamacare now. They'll be desperate for whatever we give them. As I said from the beginning, let Obamacare implode, then deal." Now, how do people cope? Here's an example. You're checking Twitter or Facebook 100 times a day. Wow. The bad guy said what? Whoosh, you feel a surge of rage. You want to scream and shout. Furious, you type out an expression of your anger. There are no simple solutions. Turning off social media, going to meditate, reading a book, certainly these things are helpful. Solutions miss the point in a way if you don't understand what the problem really is. We're just not tired in some allegorical, metaphorical sense, or even in some literal physical one. We're exhausted, mind, body, and soul, through the depletion of all our resources, which never seem to be replenished because we are in recurrent shock. We're drained and worn out by collapse, since we re-experience its shock over and over again every night, every day. And that is not a really healthy place for a mind, a body, or a society to be. Shock is a hidden cost of collapse we haven't really reckoned with, and yet reckon with it we must, because leaving us in shock, worn out, and until we are paralyzed is exactly what the bad guys want. Do the changes in the U.S. now mean that we are close to being a third world nation? We have left behind the American dream where there was the possibility of social mobility and the belief that anyone could make it. The things that were valued then, discipline, hard work, and frugality, are not so important now. The average American worker takes less vacation time than a medieval peasant. There are so many divides in America: rich and poor, native and immigrant, black and white, Trump voter and Trump hater, farm folk and urban residents who may not understand the importance of farming and the frustration of farmers. We have a culture that prizes celebrity, bling, and narcissism. The fruit of the financialization of the American economy is the super wealthy garner virtually all income growth. Everyone else's income has gone down since 1980. Automation, like other technological innovations, creates new jobs while making other jobs obsolete. At least 10 million U.S. jobs are at high risk of losing out to automation in the next decade as companies replace them with machines. Some of the top jobs at risk include fast casual cooks, think burger makers and coffee servers. One burger chain in California is already making use of a robot called Flippy to cook burgers. Movers, warehouse workers, and retail workers, including cashiers, are also threatened, according to the report. As autonomous cars move from myth to reality, taxi drivers, too, could become a thing of the past. Whether automation ends up being a net creator or destroyer of jobs, people whose jobs are automated away face difficult transitions and uncertain prospects. A 2016 study found that U.S. homicide rates were 7 times higher than in other high-income countries, driven by a gun homicide rate that was 25 times higher. Communities are beginning to lose basic services. For example, a small town's entire 4-person police force resigned because it was working with cruisers that don't work, bulletproof vests that are not fitted to them or might be expired, poor radio communications, inadequate staffing, and improper wages. Now let's turn to whether we can restore the middle class. Robert Kennedy said, "I believe that as long as there is plenty, poverty is evil. Government belongs wherever evil needs an adversary and there are people in distress. We can enact universal health care." Even a Koch family-funded study states the U.S. could insure 30 million more Americans and virtually eliminate out-of-pocket health care expenses while saving a whopping $2 trillion in the process. All told, Medicare for all would actually slightly reduce the total amount we pay for health care. Provide universal free public education, a $15 minimum wage, paid sick leave, paid vacations, paid maternity and paternity leaves, pensions, and the right of employees to organize. Clean air, clean water, a healthy food supply, and a substantial reduction in carbon pollution. Expanding pensions and health care for seniors, that is Social Security and Medicare. Progressive taxation, the right to privacy and choice. It's time for technology to serve all humankind with unconditional basic income. Only the richest of the rich are served by concentration of wealth and power that in the long term serves none of us. We must all, including the principled wealthy, work to dismantle the institutional instruments of monopoly power while creating truly democratic, accountable institutions and markets that advance the equitable distribution of wealth. Change our political system to public financing of elections, eliminating corporate cash from spoiling the nation's politics. What you can do. You can find a group who share your commitment. Face-to-face is more effective than email and social networking contacts. Online communication is needed for supporting real-world relationships. If you can't find a group of like-minded people, start your own. To identify them, post notices on social media. Make in-person contact with organizations seeking people. Choose among candidates of those filed as support or recruit candidates for all offices. Even the most minor posts are training grounds for future candidates. Communicate with your 2 senators and congressmen by phone calls, and when they come to your community, attend town halls and office meetings. Express your views assertively but politely. Ask for only one specific thing per interaction. Record meetings on videos. You can do this with a smartphone. Develop relationships with the support staff of members of Congress who provide constituent services. Members of Congress pay attention to whether a contact is with a resident of the congressional district or state, personal calls to their offices, emails, and showing up in the district, local press, group endorsements, and access to influential individuals and campaign contributors. Resources you can use include a YouTube video I made called How to Talk to Voters, and Indivisible, a practical guide for resisting the Trump agenda, has been published free. This video is entitled They're Killing Us Off, which is a shorthand for what reasonable people can conclude is designed by some people to create an environment where there will be a die-off of millions of our fellow Americans, what the Nazis called useless eaters. When you sum up all the cutbacks, suspensions, and elimination of basic protections since Trump became president, we see little in the way of compassionate actions coming from the White House. The fact that the U.S. has the worst homicide and suicide rate in the world alone should by all rights be reason for, in the words of Robert Kennedy, government belongs wherever there are people in distress. The website for this video is they'rekillingusoff.com. My email, homeplus99@gmail.com. I can be reached at 800-726-8847. In closing, keep in mind that to reach people today, we must work smarter than changemakers did in past years.